Garrett Brooks had always been a man of precision and taste. After spending a decade abroad working as a successful artist and designer, he returned to his hometown with a single purpose: to restore the old Victorian house he had inherited from his late aunt. The house stood at the edge of an affluent suburban neighborhood, a unique and slightly weathered building that had once been a landmark of the area. Its faded green shutters and intricate wooden trims hinted at its former glory, and Garrett saw in it an opportunity not just to preserve a piece of family history but to create something truly magnificent. Garrett wasn't the kind of person who sought out attention. He valued his privacy and preferred quiet, uninterrupted work. The property had been left untouched for years, and many of the neighbors barely remembered his aunt, let alone knew who he was. When he moved in, Garrett immediately began the painstaking process of restoring the house to its original beauty. He brought in specialists to reinforce the structure, sourced vintage materials from across the country, and even imported decorative stones from France to pave the long driveway leading up to the house. To complete the look, he commissioned a custom wrought iron gate in an intricate Art Nouveau style, a bold and striking piece that framed the driveway perfectly and offered a sense of security and seclusion. For Garrett, the gate was not just a practical installation, it was a work of art, carefully designed to complement the architectural style of the house. He had gone through all the proper channels, obtaining permits, consulting with local building inspectors, and ensuring that the gate met every requirement set by the city. But even before the gate was fully installed, it began attracting attention from the neighbors. Most of them simply gawked as they passed by, curious about the large-scale renovation taking place. Others muttered to themselves, questioning whether the elaborate design was appropriate for the neighborhood. None of it mattered to Garrett. He wasn't doing this to please anyone but himself. The house was his, and he had every right to restore it the way he saw fit. Among the curious onlookers, one neighbor in particular seemed to take a special interest in what Garrett was doing. Karen, a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly coiffed hair and an air of self-importance, lived 2 houses down. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and saw herself as something of an unofficial overseer of the community's aesthetics. To her, anything that deviated from the established look of the neighborhood was a problem. Garrett's project, with its bold artistic vision and non-conforming design, was exactly the kind of thing that unsettled her. At first, Karen's interest was limited to passive observation. She would stand at the edge of her property, arms crossed, watching the workers come and go. Sometimes she would make small comments to passing neighbors, her voice carrying just loud enough for Garrett to hear snippets like, "It's so out of place, don't you think?" or "Who needs a gate like that in a neighborhood like ours?" Garrett ignored her, focusing on the work at hand. He had dealt with people like Karen before, those who couldn't stand anything that challenged their narrow view of how things should be. However, Karen's passive disapproval soon turned into something more direct. One morning, as Garrett supervised the final installation of the gate, Karen marched up the driveway with an air of determination. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and commanding. Garrett turned to face her, already bracing himself for whatever complaint she was about to deliver. "I couldn't help but notice your gait," she began, her tone dripping with forced politeness. "It's quite unusual, isn't it? Don't you think it's a bit much for a neighborhood like this?" Garrett, maintaining his composure, replied calmly, "It's in keeping with the style of the house. I wanted something that matched the original design." He gestured toward the house, its partially restored facade already showing signs of the transformation underway. "And I have all the necessary permits, if that's what you're concerned about." Karen's expression hardened slightly. She hadn't expected him to be so well prepared. "Well, it's not just about permits," she said, her voice taking on a more condescending tone. "It's about the character of the neighborhood. We have a certain standard here, and we like to keep things consistent. Your gate. Well, it stands out a bit too much, don't you think?" Garrett resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He knew exactly where this conversation was headed, and he had no intention of indulging Karen's sense of entitlement. "I appreciate your concern," he said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "But this is my property, and I've made sure everything I'm doing is fully compliant with local regulations. I don't believe I'm violating any rules. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, one of the workers called out to Garrett, asking for his input on the final adjustments to the gate. Garrett gave Karen a brief nod and turned away, effectively ending the conversation. Karen stood there for a moment, clearly dissatisfied with how things had gone. She muttered something under her breath and walked back toward her house, her posture stiff with indignation. Over the next few days, Garrett noticed an increase in the number of neighbors lingering near his property, their conversations filled with whispers and furtive glances. It was clear that Karen had begun spreading her discontent, rallying others to her cause. While most of the neighbors seemed content to simply watch from a distance, a few began making pointed remarks as they passed by. "We liked it better before all this started," one woman said loudly to her companion as they walked by the driveway. Another man muttered, "Doesn't fit the neighborhood at all." Garrett ignored the comments, focusing instead on finishing the restoration. He had dealt with criticism throughout his career as an artist, and he knew better than to let the opinions of a few disgruntled neighbors affect him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Karen didn't seem like the type to give up easily, and her growing influence over the neighbors was becoming increasingly apparent. One evening, as Garrett was putting away his tools, he noticed Karen standing at the edge of her property again, this time with a few other neighbors gathered around her. They were speaking in hushed tones, but every now and then one of them would glance in his direction. Garrett felt a knot of tension form in his chest. He didn't want conflict, but it was becoming clear that Karen was intent on creating one. As he locked up for the night, Garrett resolved to stay ahead of whatever game Karen was playing. He didn't know exactly what she was planning, but he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The peace Garrett Brooks had carefully tried to cultivate since moving into his aunt's old Victorian house didn't last long. The encounter with Karen left a lingering tension in the air, but Garrett tried to push it to the back of his mind. He wasn't someone who thrived on confrontation. He preferred to let his work speak for itself, confident that once the restoration was complete, the house would become a testament to both his skill and his late aunt's legacy. However, it quickly became clear that Karen had no intention of letting the matter drop quietly. A few days after their brief conversation, Garrett was woken up early in the morning by the loud sound of a car horn blaring outside his gate. Still groggy, he got out of bed, threw on a hoodie, and walked outside to see what the commotion was about. As he approached the gate, he saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, waving down a police car that had just arrived. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, looking slightly confused by the situation. Garrett opened the gate and walked toward them, keeping his expression neutral. "Good morning, officers," he said calmly. "Is there a problem?" Before either officer could respond, Karen launched into a tirade. "Yes, there is a problem. This man has blocked off a public access road with his ridiculous gate, and it's causing issues for the entire neighborhood. We've been using this road for years, and now he's decided to cut us off without any warning." Garrett raised an eyebrow, incredulous at the boldness of her claim. "This is my private driveway," he said, addressing the officers directly. "It's always been part of this property. I have the deed and all the necessary permits for the gate. This isn't a public road." One of the officers turned to Karen. "Ma'am, can you clarify what you mean by public access road? This looks like a private driveway to me." Karen folded her arms, her expression one of righteous indignation. "It may be legally his driveway, but it's been used by the neighborhood for years as a shortcut. He's disrupting the flow of the community with this monstrosity of a gate. He didn't even consult the neighbors before putting it up." Garrett suppressed a sigh. He could already tell that this was going to be one of those mornings. "Officers," he said, keeping his voice measured, "I understand her frustration, but I can assure you I've followed every legal requirement for this gate. If you'd like, I can provide you with copies of my permits and property records." The officers exchanged a look, clearly unimpressed by Karen's argument. One of them nodded at Garrett. "That won't be necessary right now. It looks like everything here is in order, but if you have the documents handy, it wouldn't hurt to take a look." "I'll be right back," Garrett said, turning to head toward the house. As he walked away, he could hear Karen muttering angrily behind him, something about outsiders coming in and ruining everything. He ignored her, retrieved the necessary paperwork, and returned to hand it to the officers. They examined the documents carefully, then returned them to Garrett with a nod. Everything seems legitimate here. Ma'am, this is indeed private property, and Mr. Brooks has every right to install a gate on his driveway. Karen's face flushed with anger, but she forced a tight-lipped smile. Well, I suppose that's that. Then she said, clearly dissatisfied with the outcome. But don't think this is the end of it. You're upsetting a lot of people here, Garrett. This neighborhood values its traditions, and we don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and changing things. With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her house, leaving the officers and Garrett standing there in awkward silence. One of the officers gave Garrett an apologetic shrug. Sorry about that. Some people just don't like change, I guess. No worries, Garrett replied. Thanks for coming out. The officers left, and Garrett returned to the house, but the incident left a sour taste in his mouth. He had known from the beginning that Karen would be difficult, but he hadn't expected her to go as far as calling the police over something so trivial. It was clear now that she wasn't just going to let this go. She was determined to turn it into a neighborhood-wide issue. Sure enough, the next day, Garrett noticed something strange. Several of his neighbors who had previously been polite or indifferent toward him now avoided making eye contact as they walked past his property. Some of them even crossed the street to avoid walking directly in front of his gate. He also caught snippets of whispered conversations and disapproving glances directed his way. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Karen had started spreading rumors about him. Later that afternoon, Garrett received an unexpected visit from an older couple who lived down the street. They introduced themselves as Tom and Linda, longtime residents of the neighborhood. Unlike Karen, they seemed friendly, though there was a hint of unease in their demeanor. We just wanted to stop by and say hello, Linda said with a nervous smile. We've seen all the work you've been doing, and it looks interesting. Garrett invited them to sit on the porch, sensing that they had something more on their minds. After a bit of small talk, Tom finally broached the subject. Look, Garrett, we don't want to get involved in any drama, but we thought you should know Karen's been going around telling everyone that your gate is illegal and that you're planning to close off access to the park at the end of the street. Garrett frowned in confusion. The park? I'm not even near the park. That's 3 blocks away. Linda nodded. We know. But Karen's been saying that your gate is the first step in some grand plan to cut the neighborhood in half and privatize parts of it. It's ridiculous, of course, but some people are starting to believe her. Garrett felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. I appreciate you letting me know. Honestly, I'm just trying to restore this house and mind my own business. I had no idea putting up a gate would cause this much trouble. Tom sighed. Karen's always been like this. She doesn't like change, and she doesn't like it when people don't fall in line with her idea of what the neighborhood should be. Just be careful, she has a way of turning small things into big problems. After the couple left, Garrett sat on the porch, contemplating his next move. He hadn't anticipated becoming the subject of neighborhood gossip and conflict, but it was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop until she got her way. He needed to be proactive, but he also didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily. The next morning, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to gauge the mood of the community himself. As he walked past Karen's house, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered in her front yard. They fell silent as he approached, their eyes following him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Garrett nodded politely but didn't stop to engage them. By the time he returned home, he had made up his mind. If Karen wanted to play games, he would meet her on her own terms, but he would do it smartly and legally. He spent the rest of the day reviewing his property documents again, double-checking every permit and regulation. He also contacted his lawyer to inform him of the situation, just in case things escalated further. That evening, Garrett noticed Karen standing at the edge of her property again, watching him with that same smug expression she always wore. He met her gaze without flinching, silently letting her know that he wasn't intimidated. Whatever she had planned next, he would be ready. Over the next few days, it became increasingly clear that Karen had no intention of backing down. Despite the police verifying that Garrett's gate was entirely legal, she continued to stir up tension among the neighbors. Garrett would often see her standing in front of her house, talking in hushed tones to passers-by and gesturing toward his property as though it were some sort of eyesore. Although most of the neighbors didn't seem eager to get directly involved, Garrett could sense a growing unease in the air. It was as if Karen's persistent complaints were starting to poison the atmosphere of what had once been a quiet street. Garrett, however, remained focused on his work. The restoration of the house was progressing steadily, and despite Karen's attempts to distract him, he wasn't about to let her interfere with his plans. He spent his days coordinating with contractors, finalizing interior designs, and ensuring that every detail of the project was executed to perfection. Yet even as he tried to maintain his composure, he couldn't entirely ignore the tension brewing outside his property. One morning, Garrett woke up to find something unusual in his mailbox: a folded piece of paper without an envelope, stuffed inside haphazardly. He opened it and quickly realized it was an anonymous note. The handwriting was messy, almost hurried, and the message was simple but threatening: "Take down the gate, or there will be consequences." Garrett stared at the note for a few moments, feeling a wave of irritation mixed with disbelief. Was this Karen's doing? Had she convinced one of the neighbors to take things a step further? Rather than reacting impulsively, Garrett decided to document the incident. He took a photo of the note, then placed it in a folder where he kept all the paperwork related to his property. He wasn't going to escalate things unnecessarily, but if Karen or anyone else tried to pull something more serious, he wanted to be prepared. The note might have seemed like an isolated incident, but it was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, as Garrett was reviewing design plans with one of his contractors, he noticed something strange near the edge of his property. A group of neighborhood kids, no older than 12 or 13, were loitering near the gate, giggling and pointing at it. Normally, Garrett wouldn't have thought twice about kids being curious, but their behavior seemed off. When they saw him watching, they scattered, running off down the street. That evening, when Garrett went out to lock the gate, he noticed fresh scratches along the metalwork long, jagged lines etched across the otherwise pristine surface. Someone had clearly taken a sharp object to the gate, deliberately trying to deface it. Garrett felt his frustration boil over. This wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore. Someone was actively trying to intimidate him. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to suspect that Karen was somehow involved. After all, she had made it clear from the beginning that she didn't approve of his gate, and now as tensions escalated, it seemed likely that she or someone she had influenced was behind these petty acts of vandalism. The next morning, Garrett decided it was time to confront Karen directly. He wasn't interested in starting a public argument, but he wanted her to know that he was aware of what was going on. As he walked down the street toward her house, he noticed several neighbors watching from their porches and driveways, clearly curious about what was about to happen. Karen, as usual, was outside tending to her perfectly manicured front garden, her expression smug and self-satisfied. "Good morning, Karen," Garrett said, keeping his tone neutral but firm. She looked up, feigning surprise at his approach. "Oh, Garrett, how lovely to see you." "What brings you by?" Her voice was syrupy sweet, but Garrett could see the flicker of tension in her eyes. "I just wanted to talk," he said calmly. "There have been some incidents around my property: scratches on my gate, an anonymous note in my mailbox, and I can't help but wonder if you know anything about it." Karen's expression hardened ever so slightly, but she quickly recovered, plastering a smile back on her face. "Incidents? Oh dear, that sounds terrible. But no, I wouldn't know anything about that. I've been too busy organizing the upcoming block party. You know, something to bring the neighborhood together, especially with all the changes happening." Garrett resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He knew exactly what she was doing, trying to deflect blame while making herself look like the model neighbor. "I just thought I'd ask," he said evenly. "If you hear anything or see anyone acting suspiciously around my property, I'd appreciate it if you let me know." "Of course," Karen said with an insincere nod. "We wouldn't want any more trouble, would we? I'll be sure to keep an eye out." Garrett left without saying another word. The conversation had gone exactly as he'd expected. Karen wasn't going to admit to anything, but at least now she knew that he wasn't oblivious to what was happening. Still, As he walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Karen might have played innocent, but he was certain she was involved in some way, even if only by encouraging others to act on her behalf. That evening, Garrett made a few phone calls. First, he contacted his lawyer to inform him about the escalating situation. His lawyer advised him to keep documenting everything and suggested that he consider installing additional security measures. Garrett agreed. It was becoming increasingly clear that he needed to protect himself and his property more proactively. Next, he called a local security company and arranged for a consultation on installing a more comprehensive surveillance system. He already had a few basic cameras around the property, but they weren't enough to cover the entire perimeter. If things were going to keep escalating, he wanted to have clear evidence of any further incidents. By the time the security consultant arrived the next morning, Garrett had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Karen or anyone else bully him into taking down his gate or abandoning his project. The consultant walked him through several options, and Garrett opted for a system that included high-resolution cameras with night vision and motion sensors. The installation would take a few days, but once it was complete, Garrett would have eyes on every corner of his property. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to be ramping up her campaign. That same afternoon, Garrett received a letter in the mail, this time not anonymous. It was a formal notice, signed by Karen and a handful of other neighbors, demanding that he attend a community meeting to discuss the impact of his gate on the neighborhood. Garrett couldn't help but laugh at the audacity of it. She was really pulling out all the stops, trying to paint him as some sort of villain disrupting the harmony of the street. Despite how absurd it all seemed, Garrett knew he couldn't just ignore the letter. If he didn't show up, Karen would use it as ammunition to claim he wasn't willing to engage with the community. Reluctantly, he marked the date on his calendar. He had no doubt the meeting would be nothing more than another excuse for Karen to stir up trouble, but if that's what it took to shut her down once and for all, so be it. As the day of the meeting approached, Garrett prepared himself mentally. He reviewed his property documents again, making sure he had everything in order. He also drafted a brief statement outlining the steps he had taken to comply with all local regulations, just in case Karen tried to question the legality of his gate again. On the morning of the meeting, Garrett woke up early and went for a long walk, trying to clear his head. He knew that whatever happened today, it wasn't going to be pleasant, but he was determined to stand his ground. This wasn't just about a gate anymore, it was about principle. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point by the time the day of the community meeting arrived. Garrett Brooks, having dealt with Karen's incessant meddling for weeks now, knew that this was just another one of her ploys to publicly undermine him. Still, he didn't want to give her any excuse to paint him as the uncooperative outsider who refused to engage with the local residents. He spent the morning reviewing his permits and legal documents one more time, ensuring that he was prepared for whatever accusations she planned to throw his way. The meeting was set to take place in the backyard of Karen's house. As Garrett approached her property, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered around, some of whom had been openly hostile toward him over the past few days. Karen had positioned herself near a folding table draped with a white cloth, on which sat a neatly arranged stack of papers. She wore her usual air of smug self-righteousness, and as Garrett walked up, she greeted him with an overly polite but insincere smile. "Oh, Garrett, I'm so glad you decided to join us," she said in a syrupy tone that made it clear she didn't mean a word of it. "We were just about to begin." Garrett nodded curtly but didn't respond. He took a seat near the back, observing the other attendees. There were about 15 people present, most of them residents from nearby houses. Some looked genuinely curious about what was going to be discussed, while others had clearly been swayed by Karen's rhetoric and regarded Garrett with suspicion. Once everyone was seated, Karen began her speech. "Thank you all for coming today," she said, projecting her voice with a practiced air of authority. "As many of you know, there has been some concern recently about changes taking place in our neighborhood, specifically the installation of a large, rather disruptive gate at the entrance to Mr. Brooks's property." She paused for effect, glancing around to gauge the reaction of the crowd. Garrett could see several people nodding in agreement, though a few looked skeptical. Karen continued, "This neighborhood has always prided itself on maintaining a certain aesthetic harmony. We believe in preserving the character and charm of our community. And while we all respect Mr. Brooks's right to improve his property, we also believe that these changes should be made in consultation with the rest of us. Garrett remained silent, letting her finish her speech before making any moves. He could tell that Karen was trying to position herself as a reasonable, concerned neighbor rather than the vindictive busybody she truly was. Once she finished, she opened the floor for comments. A few neighbors spoke up, expressing vague concerns about how the gate affected the feel of the neighborhood. Others complained that they hadn't been informed about Garrett's plans beforehand. Finally, Garrett decided it was time to speak. He stood up, holding a folder containing all of his paperwork. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond," he began, keeping his tone calm and professional. "First of all, I want to clarify a few things. Every modification I've made to my property, including the installation of the gate, has been done in full compliance with local regulations. I obtained all the necessary permits and approvals before beginning any work. I have copies of these documents here if anyone would like to review them." He held up the folder briefly before continuing. "I understand that change can be unsettling, especially in a neighborhood that values tradition, but I want to assure you that my intention has never been to disrupt the community. I moved here to restore a family home and to create something beautiful, not to cause conflict." Garrett could see that his measured approach was having an effect on some of the neighbors. A few of them exchanged glances, seeming to reconsider their initial hostility. However, Karen wasn't about to let him off that easily. "That may be true, Garrett," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "But just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean it's right. We're not questioning your permits, we're questioning whether this gate is in the best interest of the neighborhood." Garrett resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Karen's ability to twist any situation to fit her narrative was almost impressive. "With all due respect, Karen," he replied, "I'm not sure how a gate on my private property affects anyone else's quality of life. It's not blocking access to anything. It's not causing any harm. The only thing it's doing is providing me with the privacy and security that every homeowner has a right to." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, another neighbor, Tom, the older man who had visited Garrett earlier, spoke up. "I think Garrett has a point," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet authority. "We've all seen the work he's been doing on the house. He's putting a lot of effort into restoring it, and frankly, I think it's going to improve the overall look of the neighborhood once it's finished. Maybe we should give him a chance instead of jumping to conclusions." Several heads turned toward Tom, and Garrett could see that his words had struck a chord with some of the attendees. Even Karen seemed momentarily taken aback by the unexpected show of support. Sensing that the tide was beginning to turn against her, she quickly tried to regain control of the situation. "Well, I suppose we can agree to disagree," she said with a tight-lipped smile. "But I still believe it's important for the community to have a say in matters that affect us all. That's why I've taken the liberty of drafting a petition to formally request a review of Mr. Brooks's gate by the local council." She held up a clipboard with a sheet of paper attached, clearly expecting the neighbors to line up and sign it. Garrett felt his frustration rising, but he forced himself to remain composed. He knew that reacting emotionally would only play into Karen's hands. Instead, he addressed the group once more. "You're all free to do as you wish," he said, keeping his tone even. "But before you sign anything, I would encourage you to think about what kind of precedent this sets. If a neighbor can be forced to alter or remove something on their property simply because it doesn't fit someone else's idea of what's appropriate, where does it end? Today it's my gate, tomorrow it could be your garden, your fence, or your choice of exterior paint." There was a murmur of agreement from a few people in the crowd, and Garrett could see that Karen's grip on the situation was starting to slip. Realizing that her petition wasn't going to get the overwhelming support she had hoped for, she quickly wrapped up the meeting, thanking everyone for coming and promising to keep the neighborhood's best interests at heart. As the crowd dispersed, several neighbors approached Garrett to express their support. Tom and Linda were among them. "You handled that well," Tom said with a grin. "Karen's been running this neighborhood for too long. It's about time someone stood up to her." Garrett thanked them, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had won this round, but he knew that Karen wouldn't give up so easily. She had made it clear that she considered him a threat to her self-imposed authority, and she wasn't the type to back down without a fight. Over the next few days, things remained relatively quiet. Garrett continued with his restoration work, keeping an eye out for any further signs of trouble. He also followed up with his lawyer, who advised him to stay vigilant and keep documenting everything. One evening, as Garrett was locking up for the night, he noticed something unusual near the edge of his property. A dark car was parked across the street, its headlights off. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, but it was clear that someone was watching his house. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just Karen stirring up trouble anymore, something more serious was going on. Over the next few days, the uneasy calm that had settled over the neighborhood began to unravel. Garrett Brooks could feel it in the way people glanced at him when he stepped outside or walked down the street. It wasn't open hostility anymore. Karen had lost some of her influence after the community meeting, but there was still a tension in the air. Garrett had dealt with enough people like Karen in the past to know that she wouldn't just give up and move on. She wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully, and the fact that she hadn't made another move yet only made him more suspicious. He didn't have to wait long for things to escalate again. Early one morning, Garrett was jolted awake by the sharp, mechanical sound of drilling coming from outside. Confused and still half asleep, he quickly threw on some clothes and went to investigate. As he approached the gate, he saw a group of workers in orange vests standing around with power tools and machinery. They were accompanied by a man in a dark suit who appeared to be supervising the operation. "What's going on here?" Garrett demanded, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. The man in the suit turned to him, offering a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. We're here on behalf of the city to conduct an inspection of your gate and driveway. There have been complaints about potential safety hazards." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Complaints from who?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that," the man replied smoothly. "However, the city has authorized this inspection and will need to conduct a full assessment. If any violations are found, you may be required to make changes or remove the structure entirely." Garrett felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew exactly who was behind this Karen. She hadn't been able to sway the neighbors to her side, so now she was using city bureaucracy to apply pressure. It was a tactic as underhanded as it was effective. "Fine," Garrett said through gritted teeth. "But I want to see your authorization papers." The man handed him a clipboard with a printed document bearing the city's official seal. Garrett scanned the page quickly, noting that it was a legitimate order. There was no point in arguing with the workers, they were just doing their job, but he wasn't about to let Karen's schemes go unanswered. As the inspection continued, Garrett took out his phone and called his lawyer. He explained the situation in a low, measured tone, keeping an eye on the workers as they examined his gate and driveway. His lawyer advised him to cooperate for now, but to document everything in case they needed to challenge the inspection later. Once the workers finished their assessment, the man in the suit approached Garrett again. "We didn't find any immediate safety violations," he said, sounding almost disappointed. "However, we'll be filing a report with the city. If any issues arise, you'll be notified." Garrett didn't bother responding. He simply watched as they packed up their equipment and left. The entire ordeal had been a waste of time, but it served as a reminder that Karen wasn't done with him yet. If anything, this latest stunt showed that she was willing to go to great lengths to get what she wanted. That evening, Garrett received another anonymous note in his mailbox. This one was shorter than the last, but the message was just as clear: "You should have listened. Things will only get worse from here." Garrett folded the note carefully and added it to the growing file of documentation he was keeping. He wasn't sure what Karen's next move would be, but he was determined to stay one step ahead. The next morning, Garrett woke up to find several bags of garbage scattered across his driveway. Someone had clearly dumped them there in the middle of the night. The bags were torn open, with trash strewn across the ground, creating a disgusting mess. Garrett sighed in frustration but didn't waste any time dwelling on it. He grabbed a pair of gloves and a trash bag and got to work cleaning it up. As he worked, he noticed Tom, the older neighbor who had spoken up in his defense during the meeting, approaching from down the street. "Morning, Garrett," Tom said, his brow furrowed in concern. Looks like someone's trying to make your life difficult. Yeah, it's been like this for a while now, Garrett replied, tossing a broken soda can into the trash bag. I appreciate your support, by the way. Not everyone's been as understanding. Tom nodded. Karen's been causing trouble around here for years. She doesn't like it when things don't go her way. Most people just go along with her to avoid conflict, but I've had enough of her nonsense. If you need anything, let me know. Thanks, Tom. I might take you up on that, Garrett said sincerely. It was a small comfort to know that not everyone in the neighborhood had turned against him. Later that day, Garrett decided to take proactive steps to protect himself. He contacted a private security company and arranged for them to conduct regular patrols around his property. It was an expense he hadn't planned for, but given the circumstances, it seemed necessary. He also installed additional motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of his property, ensuring that any nighttime intruders would be immediately exposed. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign. She filed another complaint with the city, this time alleging that Garrett's driveway was causing drainage issues for nearby properties. Once again, city inspectors were sent out, but they found no evidence to support her claims. Frustrated but undeterred, Karen began circulating yet another petition among the neighbors, this one calling for stricter regulations on property modifications. Despite her efforts, Garrett noticed that fewer people were willing to engage with her this time. It seemed that some of the neighbors were growing tired of her antics, especially since Garrett had been nothing but courteous and respectful throughout the ordeal. Nevertheless, Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily, and Garrett knew that as long as she was around, the conflict would continue. One evening, as Garrett was reviewing his notes and legal documents, he received an unexpected call from his lawyer. Garrett, I've been looking into some of the complaints Karen's been filing, the lawyer said. I did a little digging, and it turns out she has some connections with a local developer who's been trying to buy up properties in your area. It's possible that all of this isn't just about aesthetics, it might be about pushing you to sell. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that Karen might be working with someone else to force him out of the neighborhood added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Thanks for letting me know, he said. I'll keep that in mind. After the call ended, Garrett sat back in his chair, deep in thought. If Karen was indeed acting on behalf of a developer, that meant the stakes were higher than he'd initially realized. This wasn't just about a petty neighborhood dispute anymore, it was about money and power. Determined not to be intimidated, Garrett began preparing for whatever came next. He updated his lawyer on the latest developments, reviewed his legal options, and continued documenting every interaction and incident. He also started reaching out to a few local organizations that dealt with property rights and historic preservation, hoping to gain additional support. As the days went by, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Karen's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and it was clear that she was growing desperate. The question wasn't whether she would make another move, it was when, and how far she would go. All Garrett could do now was stay vigilant and be ready for whatever came his way. The sense of unease lingered over Garrett Brooks like a dark cloud. Days had passed since his lawyer revealed that Karen might be working with a developer, and the tension had only grown thicker. Garrett continued his routine, restoring the house, keeping his property in order, and preparing for any further nonsense Karen might throw his way. But deep down, he knew that things were approaching a breaking point. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly, especially if she was being backed by someone with deeper pockets and bigger plans. The breaking point came on an otherwise quiet afternoon. Garrett had just finished installing another section of decorative fencing when he noticed a commotion near the edge of his property. He wiped the sweat from his brow and walked toward the gate, only to find Karen standing there with two men in suits, along with a small crowd of curious neighbors gathering nearby. The men carried clipboards and looked official enough to warrant concern. "Good afternoon, Garrett," Karen said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "I'm sure you've already guessed why we're here." Garrett crossed his arms, keeping his tone calm despite the irritation bubbling inside him. "Not really, but I'm sure you're about to tell me." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, we're representatives from the city's planning and zoning department. We've received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized modifications to your property and potential code violations. We're here to conduct a formal inspection." Garrett's jaw tightened. This wasn't a surprise, it was exactly the kind of move Karen would make when all her other attempts failed. Still, he wasn't about to let her rattle him. "I've already been through inspections," he said firmly. "Everything I've done has been cleared by the city. You're welcome to check my permits." "We'll need to inspect the property ourselves to verify that," the man replied. "If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escalate this to a legal proceeding." Karen, standing a few steps behind the inspectors, was clearly enjoying herself. Garrett could almost hear her internal monologue, "Gotcha now, outsider." "Fine," Garrett said, stepping aside and opening the gate. "Go ahead, but you won't find anything out of order." The inspectors walked onto the property and began their work, carefully noting down measurements, taking photos, and checking various aspects of the renovations. Meanwhile, Karen stood just outside the gate with her arms crossed, wearing that ever-present smirk. Garrett ignored her, focusing instead on following the inspectors to ensure they didn't miss anything important. As the inspection dragged on, more neighbors gathered to watch the unfolding drama. Tom and Linda, Garrett's more supportive neighbors, appeared as well, standing off to the side with concerned expressions. "This is ridiculous," Tom muttered under his breath when Garrett passed by. "She's just trying to wear you down." Garrett gave him a brief nod but didn't say anything. He knew Tom was right. This was Karen's latest attempt to harass him into giving up, and if he lost his temper, she'd use it against him. He had to stay calm and see this through. After nearly an hour, the inspectors finished their work. They gathered near the gate, flipping through their notes as Garrett approached. "We didn't find any violations," one of them admitted, though he didn't look particularly happy about it. "Your permits are in order, and everything appears to be compliant with city regulations." Karen's expression darkened, and Garrett could see the frustration flicker across her face. She clearly hadn't expected things to go this way. Still, she wasn't about to let it end there. "Are you sure you didn't miss anything?" she asked the inspectors, her tone laced with thinly veiled annoyance. "There must be something wrong. I mean, just look at this place, it doesn't fit the neighborhood at all." The inspectors exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable with her persistence. "Ma'am, we've conducted a thorough inspection, and we didn't find any issues. If you have further concerns, you're welcome to file another complaint with the department, but for now this case is closed." Karen opened her mouth to protest but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned on her heel and stalked off toward her house, leaving the crowd murmuring among themselves. Some of the neighbors seemed amused by the outcome, while others looked disappointed that they hadn't gotten the spectacle they were hoping for. Garrett thanked the inspectors and watched as they left. Once the crowd began to disperse, Tom and Linda walked over, both looking relieved. "Glad that's over," Linda said with a smile. "You handled that well." "Thanks," Garrett replied. "But I don't think this is the end of it. Karen's not going to stop until she gets what she wants." "You're probably right," Tom agreed. "But at least more people are starting to see her for what she is. She's losing credibility." Garrett hoped Tom was right, but he wasn't ready to relax just yet. That evening, he sat down with his lawyer and went over his options. They discussed possible legal actions he could take if Karen continued to harass him, including filing a formal complaint against her for repeated false accusations. It was a step Garrett didn't want to take unless absolutely necessary, but he was beginning to realize that he might not have a choice. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get more complicated, Garrett received an unexpected email later that night. It was from a local journalist who had heard about the ongoing conflict and wanted to interview him for a story about neighborhood disputes and property rights. Garrett was hesitant at first. He didn't want to escalate things further by involving the media, but after discussing it with his lawyer, he decided it might be worth considering. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he wasn't above using public exposure to level the playing field. As he closed his laptop and prepared for bed, Garrett felt a strange sense of both exhaustion and resolve. This fight had gone on longer than he'd ever anticipated, and while he didn't enjoy being at the center of so much attention, he wasn't about to back down now. Karen had thrown everything she could at him, and he was still standing. If she wanted to keep pushing, she'd find out soon enough that he wasn't someone who could be intimidated into submission. The next day, as Garrett walked out to his driveway, he noticed something new: a small camera mounted on a pole near Karen's property, pointed directly at his gate. He shook his head, a mix of disbelief and annoyance coursing through him. It seemed Karen had found a new tactic: constant surveillance. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This was just another attempt to rattle him, to provoke a reaction. But Garrett wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he pulled out his phone, took a few pictures of the camera, and sent them to his lawyer. He was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. If Karen thought she could outlast him, she was in for a rude awakening. Garrett had already proven that he wasn't going anywhere, and now, with the law and public opinion slowly turning in his favor, he was ready to end this battle once and for all. The morning after Garrett Brooks discovered the surveillance camera pointed directly at his property, he knew it was time to take decisive action. Karen had crossed every line imaginable, and her latest move was both invasive and borderline illegal. After sending photos of the camera to his lawyer, Garrett received a call within the hour. His lawyer, sounding more determined than ever, assured him that they now had enough grounds to file a formal harassment complaint against Karen. Document everything the lawyer advised. We're going to build a case, and if she keeps this up, she'll be facing serious legal consequences. I'll also reach out to the city about that camera. It's likely a violation of local privacy laws. Garrett hung up, feeling a renewed sense of control. For weeks, Karen had been on the offensive, using every bureaucratic trick in the book to harass him. But now the tables were turning, and he was ready to push back with the full force of the law. Over the next couple of days, Garrett worked closely with his lawyer, compiling all the evidence: photos of the vandalism, copies of the anonymous notes, documentation of the repeated city inspections, and now, the surveillance camera aimed at his gate. Meanwhile, word of Karen's antics had spread beyond the neighborhood. Garrett hadn't gone to the media himself, but it seemed someone else had. A small article appeared in a local news blog, detailing the ongoing feud and painting Karen in a less than flattering light. The headline read, "Artistic Vision or Neighborhood Tyranny?" Local dispute sparks debate, though the piece remained neutral, simply reporting the facts. It was clear which side readers were inclined to support. Comments flooded in, many of them criticizing Karen's behavior and praising Garrett's patience in dealing with her. The backlash didn't stop there. A few neighbors who had initially sided with Karen began distancing themselves from her, unwilling to be associated with the growing public scrutiny. Tom and Linda, ever supportive, mentioned that several people had approached them, expressing regret for not standing up to Karen sooner. Then came the moment Garrett had been waiting for. Late one afternoon, a city official arrived at his house to personally inform him that the camera Karen had installed violated municipal regulations. She had not filed for the necessary permits, and worse, it was positioned in a way that directly infringed on Garrett's right to privacy. The official assured Garrett that Karen would be ordered to remove it immediately or face a hefty fine. When the camera was taken down the next morning, Garrett noticed something different in Karen's demeanor. She no longer wore her smug, self-assured expression. Instead, she seemed tense, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she hurried in and out of her house. It was clear that Karen's grip on the neighborhood and her confidence was slipping fast. The final blow came a few days later when Garrett's lawyer informed him that they had filed a formal harassment claim against Karen. Along with the complaint, they submitted all the collected evidence, including witness statements from neighbors like Tom and Linda. The city, no longer willing to entertain Karen's baseless complaints, launched an investigation into her actions. It didn't take long for officials to realize that Karen had been abusing the system, filing false reports and wasting city resources. Faced with mounting legal pressure and a rapidly deteriorating reputation, Karen did the one thing no one expected: she sold her house. Within weeks, a moving truck appeared in her driveway, and before long, she was gone. No farewell speeches, no final attempts to stir up trouble, just a quiet exit that left the neighborhood in a collective state of relief. With Karen out of the picture, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. People who had once avoided Garrett now approached him with friendly greetings. Some even apologized for believing Karen's lies. Tom and Linda threw a small gathering to celebrate the end of the ordeal, inviting Garrett and several other neighbors. For the first time since he'd moved in, Garrett felt like he could truly relax. As he stood on his newly restored porch, watching the sunset with a cold drink in hand, Garrett reflected on everything that had happened. What had started as a simple restoration project had turned into a battle of wills, a test of his patience and resilience. But in the end, he hadn't just restored a house, he'd earned the respect of a community and proven that standing up for yourself, even when the odds are stacked against you, is always worth it. Later that night, Garrett walked down his driveway and closed the gate behind him. The gate that had sparked so much conflict now stood tall and proud, a symbol of his perseverance. He smiled to himself as he locked it, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them,